There is a moment, somewhere between myth and documented fact, when a dynasty stops governing and starts merely surviving. On the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, in a basement room in Yekaterinburg, the last Romanov Tsar, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 servants were shot, bayoneted, and bludgeoned to death by Bolshevik executioners acting on orders from Moscow, and possibly from Lenin himself. Though that precise chain of command remains one of the most contested questions in revolutionary historiography. How did the most powerful imperial family in the world, rulers of 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, arrive at that basement? And why did so many people across 3 centuries insist, with genuine conviction, that they had been warned? The question of curses haunting the Romanovs is not, at its core, a question about the supernatural. It is a question about how power generates its own mythology, how dynasties accumulate enemies as naturally as they accumulate palaces, and how the stories a ruling family tells about itself eventually collide with the stories its subjects tell about it. The Romanovs were not simply unlucky, they were the product of specific historical forces, religious, political, geographic, and ideological, that created contradictions no amount of divine favor could resolve. But the language of curse, of doom, of blood calling for blood, was not invented by later historians. It was spoken aloud in the courts, churches, and prisons of Russia for 300 years, and that language tells us something essential about the nature of Romanov power. To understand why the dynasty felt cursed from the beginning, you have to go back to the beginning. The Romanov dynasty formally began in 1613 when 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar by the Zemsky Sobor, the assembly of the land following the catastrophic time of troubles, a period of famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and dynastic collapse, so devastating that Russia lost perhaps 1/3 of its population. The country that Mikhail inherited was not a functioning state, it was a wound. The first Romanov Tsar reportedly wept when he was told of his election, and his mother, the nun Martha, reportedly begged the assembly not to burden her son with such a task. Whether those tears were genuine or performative, they established a template that would recur throughout Romanov history, the ruler as reluctant vessel of an impossible burden. But there is a darker founding story that the Romanovs could never quite escape. In 1591, in the town of Uklig, the young Tsarevich Dmitry, son of Ivan the Terrible and the last direct heir of the Rurikid dynasty, died under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The official investigation, led by the boyar Boris Godunov, concluded it was an accident, that the epileptic boy had fallen on a knife during a seizure. Almost no one believed this. Popular opinion then, and for generations afterward, held that Godunov had arranged the murder to clear his own path to the throne. When Godunov did become Tsar in 1598, the suspicion hardened into certainty in the popular imagination. And when the time of troubles began almost immediately after, when famine killed hundreds of thousands and pretenders claiming to be the miraculously survived Dmitry rose up across the country, Russians interpreted these catastrophes as divine punishment for the spilled blood of an innocent child. The Romanovs came to power in the aftermath of all this. They inherited not just a broken state, but a political culture saturated with the idea that illegitimate violence against the innocent would be punished by God, visited upon the guilty and their successors across generations. This was not abstract theology, it was the lived political religion of 17th century Russia. And the Romanovs, who had their own complicated relationship with the Rurikid dynasty they were replacing, were never entirely free of the question of legitimacy that this founding moment raised. They built their authority on the claim of divine sanction, on the idea that the Tsar was God's anointed representative on earth, which meant that any challenge to that authority was not merely treason, but sacrilege. But it also meant that any failure of the dynasty could be read as evidence that God had withdrawn his favor. The logic was a trap. The first major rupture inside the dynasty itself came with Peter the Great, and it is here that historians begin to identify what might be called the structural curse of Romanov succession. Peter, who transformed Russia from a medieval tsardom into a European empire between his accession in 1682 and his death in 1725, was a man of ferocious energy and genuine historical vision. He built a navy from nothing, founded St. Petersburg on a swamp at the cost of tens of thousands of workers' lives, defeated the Swedish Empire at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, and dragged the Russian nobility into Western dress, Western manners, and Western administrative structures by force. he also had his own son killed. Tsarevich Alexei, Peter's heir, was a timid religious young man who wanted nothing to do with his father's modernizing project. He fled to Austria in 1716, was lured back to Russia with promises of clemency, and was then arrested, tortured under interrogation, and died in the Peter and Paul fortress in June 1718, almost certainly from the effects of torture, though the official cause of death was listed as a stroke. Peter signed the death warrant for his own blood. This was not merely a family tragedy, it was a constitutional catastrophe. In 1722, Peter issued his succession law, which abolished the traditional principle of hereditary succession and gave the reigning monarch the right to name any successor they chose. His reasoning was practical. He wanted to prevent an unworthy heir from inheriting the throne. The consequence was that for the next century, the Russian throne became a prize to be seized rather than a right to be inherited. Between Peter's death in 1725 and the accession of Paul I in 1796, Russia had 6 different rulers, several of them installed and removed by palace coups organized by the Imperial Guards regiments. Empresses were dethroned, czars were strangled. The palace at Peterhof, with its cascading gold fountains and Baroque excess, sat above a political system that could erupt into lethal violence with almost no warning. This was the world the Romanovs had made for themselves. The murder of Peter III in 1762 deserves particular attention because it established a pattern that would echo forward in ways the participants could not have anticipated. Peter III, a German prince who had grown up to become Tsar by virtue of his aunt Elizabeth's choice of successor, was a man of genuine intellectual limitations who made the catastrophic mistake of ending Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War, just as Russian armies stood on the verge of a decisive victory over Prussia. His wife, a German princess who had remade herself as Catherine, more Russian than the Russians, fluent in the language, devoted to Orthodox ceremony, steeped in Enlightenment philosophy, organized a coup against him with the help of her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his brothers. Peter III was arrested, forced to abdicate, and within days was dead at Ropsha, almost certainly strangled by Alexei Orlov, one of Catherine's conspirators. Catherine, who would become Catherine the Great, the most celebrated ruler of 18th century Russia, came to power over the corpse of her husband. She never admitted responsibility. She never faced any legal consequence, but she spent the rest of her reign haunted by the question of legitimacy that her coup had created. That question materialized in the most dramatic possible form in 1773, when a Cossack leader named Yemlian Pugachev launched the largest peasant rebellion in Russian history. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, miraculously survived. He issued proclamations in the Tsar's name, promised freedom to the serfs, and gathered an army that at its height numbered in the tens of thousands and swept across the Volga region, the Urals and the southern steppe. The rebellion was eventually crushed, and Pugachev was brought to Moscow in an iron cage and publicly executed in January 1775. But the fact that hundreds of thousands of people had been willing to follow a man claiming to be a murdered Tsar tells you something profound about how ordinary Russians understood political legitimacy. The Tsar, in popular imagination, was supposed to be the protector of the people against the nobility. When he failed in that role, or when he was murdered by the nobility, the people did not stop believing in the Tsar, they simply found another one. The Romanov dynasty had created a political theology that made it both necessary and replaceable. Catherine's own succession arrangements created the next catastrophe. She despised her son Paul, who was raised largely apart from her, and who had grown up into a man of rigid, almost pathological personality, obsessed with Prussian military drill, convinced that Catherine's favorites had corrupted Russia, and deeply suspicious of everyone around him. When Catherine died in 1796 and Paul finally came to the throne at the age of 42, he immediately reversed as many of his mother's policies as he could reach and imposed a military discipline on the court that bordered on psychological torture. He reinstated hereditary succession, which was genuinely important as a constitutional reform, but he governed with such erratic severity that within 5 years his own courtiers and guards officers were conspiring against him. On the night of March 23, 1801, a group of conspirators entered the Mikhailovsky Castle in St. Petersburg, a fortress Paul had built specifically because he was terrified of assassination, and murdered him in his bedroom. His son Alexander, who would go on to defeat Napoleon, almost certainly knew the coup was being planned. Whether he knew his father would be killed, rather than merely deposed, is one of those questions historians continue to argue about. What is not disputed is that Alexander spent the rest of his life in a state of guilt so profound that it may have shaped his turn toward mysticism in the later years of his reign, and that some historians believe contributed to his mysterious death in Taganrog in 1825, and to the legend that he had faked his death and become a wandering holy man known as Fyodor Kuzmich. The dynasty was consuming itself from within, and it had been doing so for 100 years. The Decembrist revolt of December 1825 brought a new dimension to this story. When Alexander I died suddenly without a legitimate heir, a group of reform-minded army officers attempted to use the resulting succession confusion to force a constitutional monarchy on the new Tsar. Nicholas I they failed catastrophically. Nicholas suppressed the revolt, executed 5 of the leaders, and sent over 100 others to Siberia. But the Decembrists were not peasants or Cossacks. They were educated noblemen, officers who had marched through Europe in the Napoleonic Wars and seen what constitutional government looked like. Their revolt established a tradition of educated opposition to autocracy that would grow steadily stronger over the following century, and Nicholas I's response, the creation of the Third Section secret police, the tightening of censorship, the systematic suppression of liberal and radical thought, created exactly the underground culture of conspiracy and revolutionary organization that it was designed to prevent. Nicholas I ruled for 30 years with an iron conviction that autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality were the 3 pillars on which Russia's stability rested. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had looked at the revolutions sweeping Europe in 1830 and 1848 and concluded that the only answer was absolute power maintained by absolute will. When he died in 1855, in the middle of the Crimean War, with a British and French expeditionary force besieging Sebastopol and the Russian military machine proving catastrophically unable to supply or reinforce its own troops in its own territory, the failure was not just military. It was a failure of the entire system he had built. Russia had no railways in the south. Its soldiers were armed with muskets against rifled British infantry. Its administrative apparatus was so corrupted by decades of autocratic rule that accurate information about the actual state of the army barely reached the Tsar at all. Nicholas reportedly told his son on his deathbed that he was handing him a command that was not in good order. That was, by any measure, an understatement. Alexander II, who succeeded him, understood that something had to change. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 was the most significant social reform in Russian history. 47 million people were legally freed from bondage that had defined Russian rural society for centuries. But the emancipation was also deeply flawed, requiring the freed serfs to pay redemption payments for the land they received, payments that would burden the peasantry for decades. The legal reforms of 1864, which created an independent judiciary and trial by jury, were genuinely transformative. The Zemstvo reforms created local elected assemblies that gave educated Russians their first real experience of civic participation. And yet Alexander II, the Tsar liberator, was assassinated on March 1st, 1881 in St. Petersburg by a bomb thrown by members of the revolutionary organization Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will. He had survived at least 6 previous assassination attempts. On the day he died, he had been reviewing a draft of a proposal for limited constitutional reform, a proposal that his son immediately abandoned after the assassination. The bomb that killed Alexander II also killed the possibility of a gradual constitutional evolution that might have altered the trajectory of Russian history entirely. The response of Alexander III was to build a police state. The Okhrana, the imperial secret police, expanded massively. Censorship tightened. The limited autonomy of universities was curtailed. Jews were subjected to systematic legal discrimination and periodic pogroms that the government either organized or tacitly permitted. Alexander III was physically enormous, reportedly capable of bending iron bars with his hands, and he governed with a corresponding belief in sheer force. He also died at 49 in 1894 of kidney disease, leaving the throne to his 26-year-old son Nicholas, a man who was, by almost every account of those who knew him, fundamentally unsuited for the role he was about to inherit. Nicholas II is the figure around whom the mythology of Romanov doom most densely clusters, and it is worth being precise about what the historical record actually shows. Nicholas was not unintelligent. He was not cruel in any personal sense. He was a devoted husband and father, deeply religious, fond of long walks and physical exercise, genuinely beloved by his immediate family. He was also catastrophically inadequate as an autocrat in the specific historical moment he occupied. He had been trained to believe that autocracy was not merely a political system, but a sacred obligation, that to share power was to betray both God and Russia. His father had reinforced this belief constantly. His wife Alexandra, a German princess who had converted to Orthodoxy with an intensity that sometimes alarmed even Russian observers, reinforced it further. The result was a man who faced the most severe political crisis in Russian history since the time of troubles, and responded to each escalation by retreating further into the conviction that God would provide, that the Russian people loved their Tsar, and that the advice of his ministers was probably wrong. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 was a humiliation of historic proportions. Russia lost its entire Pacific fleet, suffered catastrophic defeats on land, and was forced to negotiate peace on terms that shocked a public that had been told the war would be short and glorious. The revolution of 1905, triggered by the massacre of peaceful petitioners on Bloody Sunday in January of that year, when imperial guards fired on a crowd led by a priest named Georgy Gapon that was marching to present a petition to the Tsar at the Winter Palace, nearly brought the dynasty down entirely. Nicholas survived by issuing the October Manifesto, which promised a constitution and a parliament, the Duma. He then spent the next 12 years systematically undermining both. Into this atmosphere of political crisis and court anxiety came Grigory Rasputin, and it is impossible to talk about the final years of the Romanovs without talking about him at length, because Rasputin is simultaneously the most mythologized figure in the Romanov story and one of the most genuinely revealing. He was a Siberian peasant mystic, born around 1869 in the village of Pokrovskoye in western Siberia, who had acquired a reputation as a holy man and healer in the religious underground of early 20th century Russia, a world of wandering pilgrims, ecstatic prayer, and folk healing that existed in parallel with official orthodoxy. He arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903, and within a few years had gained access to the imperial court through a series of aristocratic patronesses who were drawn to his reputation for spiritual power. His hold over Alexandra was secured by a single overwhelming fact. He appeared to be able to stop the bleeding episodes of Alexei the Tsarevich, who suffered from hemophilia, a disease that the family kept secret from the Russian public, and which meant that every cut, every bruise, every fall could potentially kill the heir to the throne. Whether Rasputin's interventions actually helped Alexei remains medically debated. Some historians suggest he may have used hypnosis, which can have genuine physiological effects. Others note that several of his interventions came after Alexandra had been persuaded to stop administering aspirin, a blood thinner that would have worsened bleeding episodes and whose dangers were not understood at the time, whatever the mechanism. Alexandra believed absolutely in Rasputin's ability to keep her son alive, and that belief gave him a political influence that was entirely disproportionate to his formal position. By 1915 and 1916, with Nicholas at the front commanding an army that was bleeding to death against the German war machine, Alexandra was writing her husband daily letters in which Rasputin's advice on ministerial appointments and political decisions was relayed as if it were divine instruction. Ministers were appointed and dismissed on his recommendation. The Council of Ministers became a revolving door. In the space of roughly a year, Russia had 4 different prime ministers, 3 different foreign ministers, and 3 different ministers of the interior. The administrative coherence of the state was disintegrating in real time. The murder of Rasputin in December 1916 by a group that included Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, and the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the imperial family, was not simply the elimination of a disreputable influence. It was a signal of how completely the dynasty had lost the confidence of even its own aristocratic base. The conspirators believed, apparently sincerely, that removing Rasputin would somehow save the monarchy. They were wrong. Alexandra's grief was inconsolable, and Nicholas's response was so mild that it confirmed in the minds of the nobility that the Tsar was incapable of governing. The murder came too late to change anything structural, and it removed the one figure whose death might have stabilized the court, while leaving all the underlying political and military catastrophes entirely intact. The February Revolution of 1917 was not organized by Bolsheviks or professional revolutionaries. It began with bread riots in Petrograd. The city had been renamed from St. Petersburg in 1914 as a gesture of anti-German sentiment. Riots that started among women waiting in bread lines in the bitter cold of February and spread with astonishing speed when the garrison troops refused to fire on the crowds. Within days, the Duma had formed a provisional government, and the commander of the Petrograd military district had informed Nicholas that he had no loyal troops available to suppress the uprising. Nicholas abdicated on March 2nd, 1917, at a railway siding near Pskov, signing away 300 years of Romanov rule in a document that was, by all accounts, written in a remarkably steady hand. He also, in a final gesture of dynastic miscalculation, abdicated on behalf of his son as well, something he had no legal authority to do, which meant that the abdication passed to his brother Michael, who refused the throne the following day. The dynasty ended not with a dramatic final stand, but with a series of administrative decisions made by exhausted men on a train. What followed the abdication was 8 months of provisional government, of competing political factions, of continued catastrophic war, and then the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917. The decision to execute the Romanovs in July 1918 was driven by the immediate military situation. White army forces were approaching Yekaterinburg, and the Bolsheviks feared that a rescued Tsar would become a rallying point for the counter-revolution. The execution was carried out in the basement of the Ipatiev house, a merchant's home that had been requisitioned as a prison by a squad led by Yakov Yurovsky. The killing was chaotic and prolonged. The bullets ricocheted off the jewels sewn into the daughters' corsets. The bodies were taken to a forest outside the city, burned with acid and fire, and buried in 2 separate locations. The Soviet government did not publicly confirm the execution of the entire family for decades. The bodies were not officially identified until DNA analysis in the 1990s confirmed the remains found in 1991. The last 2 children, Alexei and one of the daughters, most likely Maria, were identified from a separate burial site only in 2007. The historical consequences of the Romanov dynasty's collapse were immense and long-lasting in ways that are still being worked through. The revolution did not simply replace one ruling class with another. It destroyed the entire social, legal, religious, and economic order of Imperial Russia and replaced it with something that had never existed before anywhere on earth, a single-party state committed to an ideology of total transformation. The Orthodox Church, which had been the spiritual foundation of Romanov legitimacy for 3 centuries, was subjected to systematic persecution, its clergy arrested, its churches demolished or converted to warehouses and cinemas, its monasteries dissolved. The nobility was liquidated as a class. The peasantry, which had been promised land by the revolution, found itself collectivized by force under Stalin in the late 1920s and early 1930s, in a process that killed millions and destroyed the agricultural economy of the country for generations. The specific geography of Romanov power, St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace, Tsarskoye Selo, with its amber rooms and formal gardens, the Kremlin with its golden domes, became the geography of Soviet power, repurposed and renamed, but occupying the same physical and symbolic space. Lenin's body was placed in a mausoleum on Red Square, a space that had been the ceremonial heart of Russian Orthodox imperial ritual for centuries, and Soviet leaders reviewed military parades from the same elevated position from which Tsars had once received the adoration of the people. The forms of power changed, the spatial logic of power remained. The question of whether the Romanovs were cursed is, in the end, a question about how we explain historical catastrophe. The language of curse belongs to the same intellectual tradition as the language of divine sanction. Both assume that history has a moral logic, that power carries obligations, and that the violation of those obligations will eventually produce punishment. What the historical record actually shows is something more complex and, in its way, more disturbing. The Romanovs were not destroyed by supernatural forces. They were destroyed by the specific contradictions of the system they had built and refused to reform, an autocracy that claimed divine authority while depending on a social order that was visibly unjust, an empire that needed modern institutions while its rulers feared that modern institutions would undermine their power. A dynasty that generated legitimacy through the mystical body of the Tsar, while that body became increasingly unable to perform the functions a 20th century state required. Every element of what later generations would call the Romanov curse can be traced to a specific historical decision made by specific historical actors under specific conditions. Peter's succession law created a century of palace coups, the failure to emancipate the serfs before 1861, and the terms of the emancipation when it came created a peasantry that was legally free but economically trapped. The suppression of the Decembrists drove political opposition underground and radicalized it. The assassination of Alexander II ended the possibility of gradual constitutional reform. The Russo-Japanese War exposed the military weakness of the autocratic state. The decision to enter the First World War in 1914, against the advice of several senior officials who warned that a major war could destroy the dynasty, was the final, irreversible commitment. None of these were acts of fate. All of them were choices. And yet the language of curse persisted, and it persists still because it captures something true about the experience of living inside a system that seems to be moving toward its own destruction with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. The Romanovs themselves used this language. Nicholas II wrote in his diary on the day he abdicated, in the same calm, slightly detached tone he used to record the weather and his afternoon walks, that he had made the decision for the good of Russia. He apparently believed this. He apparently believed until very close to the end that God had a plan for him and his family. In the basement of the Apatiev house, the walls were marked with what investigators later found to be a quotation from the German poet Heine, whether written by the guards or by the prisoners is unknown, about the destruction of kings. The last thing Nicholas II saw was a room full of armed men who had been authorized by a revolutionary government to end 300 years of history in a single night. The bones of the Romanovs were reburied with full Orthodox ceremony in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998, in the presence of President Boris Yeltsin, who called it one of the most important acts of national reconciliation in Russian history. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas Alexandra and their children as passion bearers, saints who accepted death with Christian humility in 2000. The Apatiev house had been demolished on the orders of Boris Yeltsin himself when he was regional party secretary in 1977, before he became a symbol of post-Soviet Russia. On the site where it stood, a cathedral was built. History in Russia has a way of returning to the places it tried to erase. What the story of the Romanovs ultimately reveals is not the power of curses, but the power of unresolved contradictions. A dynasty that claimed to rule by divine right could not survive the moment when its subjects stopped believing in that right. A state that claimed to protect the people could not survive the moment when it became undeniable that the state was the primary source of the people's suffering. A political theology that identified the Tsar with Christ could not survive the moment when the Tsar became, in the eyes of millions, not a sacrificial savior, but a sacrificial victim of his own system. The curse was real, it was just not supernatural. It was structural, historical, and entirely human, which in the end makes it far more instructive than any ghost story.